Good afternoon. My name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Collegium Institute, which serves the University of Pennsylvania, as well as PRUX, the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society here at Penn, and Dappled Things, a quarterly of ideas, art, and faith. I'd like to take a moment to particularly thank all of our wonderful co-sponsors as well who've helped make this event possible. Image Journal, Lumen Christi Institute, the Nova Forum, Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and Wellspring, a Mother Artist Project. I'm the Managing Director of Collegium's Ars Vivendi Arts Initiative, which aims to create a conversational space to explore the relationship between beauty, faith, and the arts, probing their importance to human culture and to a life well lived. The initiative seeks to integrate artistic craft and practice with an understanding of aesthetics and an appreciation for the intellectual life behind the creative mind. Today, we gather for a special conversation on the art we live with, seeking, prioritizing, and cultivating beauty in the everyday. From the time of prehistory, we humans have had a fascination with making things, shaping things, and collecting things. It could be said that at our core, we are makers and keepers. We can look to ancient examples like the cave paintings in Lascaux or Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey, a site which is considered one of the first cities in the world. Çatalhöyük is filled with artful human activity, from painted walls to volcanic glass used as mirrors and built-in nooks for keeping special items. It is an emblem to human making, keeping, and collecting, a place where men, women, and children prepared, consumed, and stored food, as well as slept, socialized, and hid away their treasures while burying their ancestors beneath the floors they walked on and climbing up on their roofs to travel about and visit fellow city dwellers. The spaces we inhabit, from our homes to classrooms to airport gates, offices, and sacred spaces, are alive, shifting, transforming, sometimes chaotically unfolding, it seems, at other times, places of simple, clean beauty. And while we humans are actors in this main stage of our lived reality, the interior, we can change it and shape it. We too are formed by it. At the end of the 19th century, Oscar Wilde wrote a manifesto for the significance of the decorative arts, calling it the art we live with. This art that does or could fill our homes, offices, classrooms, works on the soul, he writes, stirs our imaginations, gives us rest, and trains us to see. However, amidst the technologized and fast-paced spaces we inhabit, we can too easily forget to think about beauty and instead opt to maximize other outcomes, whether that's speed, profits, or efficiency, at the expense of the dignity and aesthetic conscience of the human person. So why then does beauty matter? Beauty is often a dirty word or seen as something only for rich people. But what if it was about creating dignity, bringing a humanity to the table? These words were spoken in the fall of 2018 by acclaimed interior designer Ilsa Crawford during a lecture she gave here at the University of Pennsylvania, in which she asked these questions about the importance of beauty and its connection to the environment, justice, and human dignity. She shared about a project that completely reshaped a church parish hall and soup kitchen, and at the end, when one of the men who visited this space weekly was asked about the transformation, he said, "I love that it looks this way, because it shows that someone cares." And so today, we gather to talk about beauty, about objects, about our proclivity as humans to not only make beauty, but our knack for finding it and collecting it in unexpected places. Our interior spaces and our deep connection to them have filled the canvases and visions of many an artist, from Biedermeier paintings of women in rooms to still lifes and domestic images of the Annunciation, and even children's stories like Madeline and Brambley Hedge. The impulse to shape and create our interiors and our artful activity of many forms and kinds beyond the traditional high arts unites us as humans and unites us to the divine. And so today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our 4 panelists. Shemaiah Gonzalez is a writer who thrives in moments where storytelling, art, literature, and faith collide. Her work has appeared in America Magazine, Image, and Loyola Press, and her biography on writer Brian Doyle will be published with Liturgical Press this spring. A Los Angeles native, she now lives in Seattle with her husband and their 2 sons. John Herreid is a graphic designer and illustrator living in Cincinnati, Ohio, with his wife and 4 children. He is the catalog manager at Ignatius Press and has designed many book covers as well as illustrating 3 children's books. He is the editor of an upcoming collection of prints, The Catholic Home Gallery, to be published by Ignatius Press in 2023. Marina Gross-Hoy is a museum studies Ph.D. candidate at the University of Quebec in Montreal, focusing on the development of digital projects for museum visitors. She holds a master's from the École du Louvre and previously worked on the education team at the Agence France Museum, which supported the creation of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. Marina writes The Museum Gaze, a newsletter that explores what looking at artwork can teach us about seeing the art of our ordinary lives. And finally, James K.A. Smith is editor-in-chief of Image Journal, a quarterly journal at the intersection of art, faith, and mystery, as well as professor of philosophy at Calvin University. He is an award-winning author and speaker. His books include On the Road with St. Augustine, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, and most recently, How to Inhabit Time, Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, Living Faithfully Now. And so now I'll be handing things off to our 4 panelists who will each give some short opening remarks of about 10 minutes each, beginning with Shemaiah. When all 4 have finished, we will come together for questions and conversation that I'll moderate, and we will then end by opening the floor to questions from all of you in attendance. Please feel free to start sending in your questions throughout the event using the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. While we won't be able to get to all of your questions, we hope to get to as many as we can. And so now I will pass off the screen to Shemaiah Gonzalez.
Thank you, Jess. I'm so happy to be here. To prepare some thoughts today on the art we live with, I took a little walkabout in my cozy 1,600 square foot 1920s craftsman home here in Seattle. What object would I share with you? Would I tell you about the built-in nook in my kitchen? It's an architectural detail you don't find in homes anymore. This nook was possibly built to place a telephone with 2 shelves. The top shelf most likely held the telephone itself, and the bottom its electronic parts, usually hidden by a panel long since removed. I wish I could tell you that we use this nook for something glamorous, but it's sort of a catch-all for pens and Post-it notes in my middle school son's lunch boxes. But this is the nook we have taken pictures of my sons each first day of school since they were preschoolers. I laughed thinking back to that first day when they were both in school, and the moment my oldest saw his younger brother in a uniform, complete with preppy red sweater and plaid tie to match his own. The 2 of them, delighted, held on to one another. They couldn't take their eyes off each other long enough to look at the camera. Now, these boys have surpassed their mother in height and stand taller than the nook, which has marked their growth for the past decade. This nook is functional and beautiful and a medium for our art of storytelling. But then I wondered if I should share something more cultured with you, like the Bruce Herman painting that hangs in our dining room. Bruce Herman and I struck up a friendship at Image Journal's Glen workshop a few years ago. And in the months following, he dreamt up a 5 by 4 foot triptych entitled Other Echoes Inhabit the Garden. after a line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. The painting depicts me sitting under a fiery autumnal tree bursting with gold and titanium leaves. Bruce described the world in the painting as both a place of serenity and intensely explosive energy, barely contained in the branches. The lower panel of the triptych is mostly abstract, but some images are slightly discernible as ghostly faces, memories of those who have walked with me, those who have made me who I am. But it's that explosive tree rooted deep within the soil which I lean upon that takes up most of the painting. I believe that tree represents God and how being rooted in him has marked my life. This magnificent painting was delivered the very first day of pandemic lockdowns in Seattle, the first in the country. Shlomo, the delivery man, called me every day for a week as he delivered art across the country. We had become quite friendly, talking about the state of emergency brewing in Seattle. Delivery was scheduled for the evening, and we invited Shlomo to share our dinner. But the empty freeway, streets, and sidewalks spooked him. He dropped off the painting and quickly left. When the halls of the Met or the Art Institute in Chicago were quiet and empty, I had my very own painting in my own home. Some afternoons when the quiet and loneliness overtook me, I spent the afternoon gazing upon the painting, a reminder of my past and my future. But the objects I returned to as I walked around my home are a trio of plastic dinosaurs that sit on a shelf in my office. Created by a mold-orama vending machine popular in the 1970s, these dinosaurs are unnatural colors of baby blue, avocado green, and fluorescent orange, and one sits wonky on its misshapen pedestal. But it's the story behind these objects that make them beautiful to me. When I was a child, my grandpa took me to the Los Angeles Zoo, the same zoo featured in the opening credits of Three's Company. Once, now lost to time, was a super 8mm film of me that day, balanced on the edge of that iconic water fountain shown in the opening credits. I had to be about 4 or 5. It was the hottest day of the year. So hot I could smell each of the animals as I walked past. My grandfather bought me an ice cream cone, and that might have been the only time I let go of his hand that day. He didn't care how hot and sweaty and sticky I was. He loved me. Near the zoo exit, my grandpa let me choose a souvenir of the day, an animal from the mold-orama machine. I chose a gorilla. I can still smell the scent of liquid plastic as it pumped into the mold, and I remember how warm it felt in my hands when I retrieved it out of the machine. The rest of my childhood is not as idyllic as that day. Poverty, abuse, and neglect were themes of my childhood. But that day was glorious. Like the Super 8 film, the gorilla has been lost in the shuffle of time. But a few years ago, I found a mold-orama machine in Chicago's Field Museum while on vacation with my family. Instantly, I remembered that perfect day and my grandpa's love. I told the story to my sons, and we each selected a figurine to mark our day. I know I'm not alone when I attach a story to a beloved object. When I'm a guest in other homes, I wander looking at art on the walls or objects that cover side tables and credenzas. And the host will find me hovering over something beautiful or remarkable and say, you know, there's a funny story about that. Even the prints that we hang of museum originals are reminders of that visceral moment when we stood before the original. You may have heard the word Ebenezer, perhaps from the 18th century hymn, Come thou fount of every blessing, or the miserly protagonist of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The word is found in the Old Testament. Under attack by the Philistines, the Israelites were outnumbered and feared for their lives. They begged the prophet Samuel to ask for God's help. He told them to get rid of their foreign gods, their Baals, their Ashtoreth. They do, and God confused and panicked the Philistines. The Israelites were victorious. Samuel, knowing that God had intervened, marked the moment by placing a stone on the battle line. He called the stone Ebenezer, or stone of help. The stone will remind them of when God's glory shone through. I often wonder if this is what we do to a lesser, smaller degree. We surround ourselves with beautiful objects in our home, each one with a story to remind us of a moment when we connected with another person or when we experienced something remarkable, when beauty or goodness overwhelmed us, when God's glory shone through, but for a moment. Thank you. We're now going to hear from John Herreid. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Shemaiah. Well, it's a very beautiful reflection there on the home. It's somewhat similar to what I'm going to be talking about, which is also about objects in my home. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about finding sources of inspiration for your home that reflect your own artistic sensibilities, but also help foment creativity. I'll start with a quote. "A home is not dead, but living, and like all living things, must obey the laws of nature by constantly changing." The man who wrote those words was Carl Larsson, who together with his wife Karen became famous in the late 19th century for the home they created together in Sundborn, Sweden. Carl was a painter whose greatest ambition was to become known for monumental historical paintings, but it wasn't to be. Karen trained to be an academic painter and was skilled with portraits, but that career also did not come to be. What did come to be was their marriage, 8 children, and a small farmhouse Karen inherited from her family, which would become immortalized in warm, lively watercolors by Carl. Karen designed the furniture, textiles, and even the clothing the family wore. Carl expanded and redecorated the home extensively. Carl wrote much about his philosophy of home. He rejected the idea of a house as a status symbol filled with furniture and art designed to impress others. The Larsson ideal of a home was one that was organic, based in a specific time and place, open to outside artistic influence, while remaining indebted to folk traditions, and most of all, practical. When I began repainting and decorating the home my family moved to here in Cincinnati last year, I took direction from the Larssons. I've always loved the warm colors used in the Larsson home in Sundborn, featuring lots of rusty reds, dark greens, and natural wood. The green behind me is actually inspired by some of the colors there. I also took inspiration from the furniture. Carl Larsson loved collecting antiques, but he was never precious with them. In fact, he and Karen often altered or painted antiques in order to make them fit better into his home, something I am too faint-hearted to do myself. There's one of my favorite books about the two of them, holding here. Also note that one of his paintings is featured on the promotional graphics for this event. So apart from telling you to Google Carl Larsson and Karen Larsson, what other advice might I have? Well, there's 3 points. These are just drawn from my own experience. First of all, feed your tastes. A few years ago, I was fed up with negativity on social media, and I started posting a work of art every day, just on my personal account. I ran out of art to post that I knew of already after a few months, and I had to start looking around for more online. And in the process, I just discovered dozens more of now favorite artists, both contemporary and classic. I post them now on a Facebook page, which I call JR's Art Place. I have prints from several of these artists now on my walls, including some original prints by people who do block printing. The Larson family also did something similar to this. If you look at their home, they have Japanese prints hanging alongside old etchings, modern drawings by their friends hanging next to academic work from many hundreds of years before that. So start off with your current tastes in art, in color, and in decor, and then start looking at things that might be just a little different. Your artistic world will start expanding very quickly. Museums, social media, art accounts, bookstores, there's many places to look. Try adding an accent of a favorite color to a room using a shade you might normally think is too daring. Do you like a certain artist? Look them up. See if she or he was part of an artistic movement or who they studied with. There may be others similar that you would love. Second, decorate for you. What inspires you? What makes you feel at home? Could be a print, a painting, a chair, a mug. Filling your home with items that feed your imagination and fire your spiritual senses and bring you comfort are all aspects of a real homely home. And to relate back to Carl Larson, a home is not dead, but living. Changing and shifting is part of that organic nature of a home and one that accommodates growth for you and your family. Third, don't decorate to impress. The pressure that Carl Larson identified to make your home a status symbol has only grown since his time, especially with the prevalence of an all-saturating social media culture. It's very easy to allow trends or online influence to mess with your perceptions or to create unrealistic perfectionism in your mind. Once you start seeing your home through the eyes of an imaginary critic, it can cripple your ability to free your artistic sensibilities. So just as a few last points, I have a suggestion exercise. Think of 3 or more things in your home that you love, 3 or more things in your home or apartment. Try to get particular, something like a wall tile, a lighting fixture, a book, a print, things like that. And then try to think how you can build on that. Here are 3 examples from my own home. We have a Dutch door, one of those doors that separates into 2 pieces and that leads to our kitchen. I removed the door and so I could strip all the paint off, and I refinished it, and now the natural wood shines through in something that looks somewhat similar to the inspiration of Carl Larson. It's a lovely part of the architecture, and it provides an anchor from that passage from the living area to cooking area. And it also helped inspire the way that we remodeled the kitchen last year. In our home, we also have 2 lithographic prints by David Lance Goines, who's probably most famous for designing a lot of the signage and posters for Chez Panisse in Berkeley. These prints were given to me and my wife shortly after we were married. I love the colors of them, which are warm greens, browns, yellows. And those colors inspired the paint colors in our last home in California. And they also provided a secondary inspiration to the paint colors in our current one. And they currently serve as a focal point to our dining room. Out to the living room, we have a bookshelf of all old antique books. About 16 years ago, I purchased a set of old scientific encyclopedias about the natural world, originally published sometime in the 1930s. Each book in this series is a different color, and it has elaborate embossing on the spine. They're a real pleasure to pick up and look at and to handle. And my kids will pull them out just to look at the various plates of insects and flora and fauna that they contain. Around that encyclopedia on the shelf, I've built up a collection of other antique books with design and illustrations that have helped inspire my work. And I never stop finding inspiration in them. Finally, I work in graphic design. It's a very visual medium. So whenever I'm feeling dry creatively, I tend to go to a bookstore or a museum or a library just to try to feed my senses with different things I can see and get inspiration from. And you never know what they may inspire. For example, I saw a first edition of The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, and it ended up inspiring the cover of an entirely different book about the spiritual life. So having places where you can encounter design and art to rekindle your creative flame is very important. So having art, a variety of books, colors and shapes in your home that also feed that fire, it's invaluable if you're someone like me who works in a creative field. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you. I will pass it along here to Marina Gross-Hoy.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, John. Hello. So my name is Marina Gross-Hoy, and I'm going to start off with a story. It takes place at the beginning of the pandemic, the first summer, a hot July evening of a very scary and uncertain time. And I was taking a huge garbage bag full of my son's diapers out of our apartment into the bin in front of our home. And as I was turning back to go inside, I turned around and looked up, and I saw this panoramic sunset stretching across the sky. The clouds, they looked like mountains. There were dramatic rays of sunlight shining across the sky, and the colors were shifting as the sun made its way down to the horizon. And I looked at that. And the first thought that came to mind was, if this were a painting in a museum, it would be so beautiful. And that made me feel so sad, because I could imagine literal paintings of cloudscapes that I had spent time looking at in museums, where I tried to imagine what it would feel like to be there, where I had appreciated the tiny details of what I was looking at. And here I was in front of the real thing, and I wasn't even paying attention. And I wondered in that moment, under that sunset that I almost hadn't seen, what would it mean to look at my life with that same careful attention that I used with paintings in museums? And if I could even figure out how to do that, how to use this museum gaze on my ordinary life, would it change anything? Would anything happen? Now, that's a question that I feel somewhat qualified to explore in my professional life and now my academic life. I learn and work in museum education and museum interpretation. And I know that learning how to look is a skill that can be taught, that can be learned. And so the heart of what my work is when a visitor is in front of an object, what happens? What's that experience? And how can museums help facilitate a meaningful connection, a meaningful dialogue between visitor and object? So I thought, okay, let me think about that question. What does it mean to look at life like art? And again, this was the pandemic, so it was a couple of months before I could actually explore that question. It was actually that winter of 2020. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go on a walk, and I'm going to pretend that the sidewalk is walking me through an immersive exhibition. And what would that do for my experience? What would that change? So I was like, okay, here we go. I went outside and I looked around, and it was horrible. It was really not enjoyable, because if everything is art, what do you look at? Do you spend 5 minutes looking at the bicycle attached to the bike rack? Like, do you look at this dead leaf that's on the snow? Like, I just got stuck, and I was looking at everything, and I got so frustrated that I gave up and I walked away. And as I was kind of huffily walking down the sidewalk, thinking I couldn't even get this right, I started noticing the creams and the browns and the whites of the slush that is Montreal winter. And I noticed the textures in the snow and the slush of the boots who had walked before me, or the tires of a bicycle. And it was really beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. And that's when I realized that this museum gaze is not literal. We're not literally pretending we're in a museum. No, it's a shift in the attention we're paying. And we're not imposing anything on our experience. It's the opposite. It's an opening. We're opening ourselves to experience. And we're even surrendering our control of what that experience will be. And maybe that's a tiny surrender at the beginning, as we see if we can trust this process. And with that surrender, we're thinking something is going to happen. Something's going to meet us there. Something might even be revealed, even in the ordinary. Now, this type of attention reminded me of something that we talk about a lot in museums, which is slow looking. And slow looking is exactly what it sounds like. It's just looking at an object slowly, instead of the 7 seconds that people often use on average with an artwork in a museum. So it could be a minute, it could be an hour, whatever that is, it's just committing your full attention to an object. Tate has a guide to slow looking, and they describe that as it being about you and the artwork, allowing yourself time to make your own discoveries and form a more personal connection with it. So you're kind of letting go of what you're told you should think is important about the artwork and seeing what it has to say, having a dialogue. And it might sound boring to just look at one thing really slowly, but actually it's kind of magical. Like, I've had experiences with paintings where I think, oh my gosh, nothing's going to happen. And then things start happening. It's almost like those magic eye images you might have looked at when you were little, where it's a digital abstract image and you stare at it long enough and 3D images start appearing. It's like that same level of, oh, wow, things being revealed and forming a personal connection with what you're seeing. So when I started bringing this attention to my own life, it often started with a slowing down. Sometimes that was literal. Sometimes I would stop moving and look around, but sometimes it was just a breath, coming to the moment, bringing my full self to what was around me and thinking maybe something might happen. And sometimes it was just that simple. And sometimes I played with using different tools, some tools that I used from my museum education background, some that I discovered in the field as I'm collecting this data. Sometimes, so something like, for example, you're looking in front of a painting. You're looking at a painting, you might do a visual analysis. You might see just simply, what colors do you see? What are the qualities of colors? The palette, how do they work together? You might look for the sources of light. Where are they coming from? How do they interact with the objects in the scene? And because, you know, we're in the scene, we can see, do we feel the warmth on our hand? Can we make shadows with the light? So there are all sorts of visual elements that we can play with. And also because it's not just visual art, our lives are full-bodied, where we can pay attention to all of our senses. What do we hear? What do we smell or taste? Can we touch things around us? And what does that add to our experience? And as we're in our bodies with our senses, we can also pay attention to, what is our body doing? Are we seated? Are we looking up? Do we want to respond to what we're seeing with our bodies? That's something that sometimes in museum programming, maybe you'll copy a statue and that can help you look at it differently. Maybe we want to copy a tree or a plant, or maybe we want to respond to what we're seeing in a certain way, which is something I play with when I'm alone in the forest. When there's no one around for the squirrels, that can be an interesting way to explore experience. And as we're moving into our bodies, we might notice if we feel any sensation. Do we feel pain? Do we feel emotion? Are we carrying the tightness of anxiety? Syrupy sadness, fluttering excitement? What are we bringing to the moment? What is our emotional state? And also, what are we thinking? What stories are we telling ourselves about what we're seeing and about its value even? And what stories are we telling ourselves about ourselves in the experience, and maybe even our own value? And other ways to reframe that might be more compassionate or even interesting. So this museum gaze, it was an outer awareness, but it was also a gaze turned inward. And when those two met, it always feels like a dialogue. It feels like when I bring my full self, when I bring my needs and desires, my reality to the real moment around me, I'm always met. Sometimes I'm held and comforted. Sometimes I'm nourished, delighted. Sometimes I'm empowered. Sometimes I'm challenged, but it's always an encounter. And it's a repeated act over and over. I found that it's been an act of care. It's been caring for myself. It's been letting myself be cared for. And as my well gets filled up in this exchange, I've noticed I have more energy for action, for changes that need to happen, for stories that need to be told, connections that need to be made. It's a filling up, but it's also a pouring out. And it's so enjoyable. Too, there's this aspect of pleasure, because this is a practice of wonder. We're attuning our eyes to look for the wonder everywhere. Like the other night, I was driving home. I was feeling really depleted and kind of sad. And I looked up, and the sky was this like deeply saturated periwinkle. And it felt like it was there just for me, that it met my depletion and filled me up. And I felt held and not alone. And that kind of moment happens all the time, because when you're training your eyes to look in a certain way, you're going to start seeing because your eyes are primed and you're alert, even when you're not looking for it in a certain moment. And so these experiences over time, for the past almost 2 years now, I would describe them as being moments of connection, of meaning making, of immersion, of learning how to be more aware. And these are all characteristics that I would use to describe very interesting interactions with art in a museum. So it seems to me that as we talk about the art we live with, this question of, and how I'm interpreting that, of looking at life like art, it feels like it's rooted in a very important way with the attention we use with the lives we live in. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass the baton over to James K.A. Smith.
Thanks so much, Marina. Thank you, Jess, for gathering such a rich conversation around these themes. This is making my day. I'm a passionate devotee of the decorative arts, and so much to talk about. I feel like I'm going to be echoing my fellow panelists. I am an inveterate and stubborn philosopher, and so I want to start by making a distinction. The distinction I want to make, because I think it'll open up some space for us to continue to think about these things. I want to make a distinction between art and, let's call it, the aesthetic aspect of life. So we're talking about the art that we live with, and we're stealing that line from that wonderful passage in Oscar Wilde's The Critic as Artist. And what's interesting is Wilde in particular zooms in on something like William Morris wallpaper as an example of the art that we live with. And so what you realize is the art that he's attuned to, and I think that we want to explore here, isn't just the art objects that sort of receive our focused attention as artifacts of fine art, but also these arts that are kind of the wallpaper of our life, the water in which we swim. And so let's distinguish between art, or what you could call fine art or art objects, which are sort of defined by this imaginative aesthetic mode. And then we could, though, think more broadly about what I'll just call the aesthetic aspect of life, which is to say, every facet of our human cultural environments has an aesthetic moment to it. It has an aspect that is sort of supposed to be resonating with our imagination. And sadly, most of the aesthetic aspect of so much of what we live amongst, I'm here in a terrible, terrible cinder block office with hideous filing cabinets, and I'm thinking about how sad the aesthetic aspect is of so many things. But what we're talking about is celebrating and noticing and cultivating and curating environments that we live in which the aesthetic aspect is beautiful, joyful, delightful. So let's talk about a life lived aesthetically in the everyday. Part of that will include the art objects that surround us and that we we place in our environments to be shaped by and encountered by and moved by and live with. But then I'm just as interested in the wallpaper, so to speak. I'm just as interested in those sort of other environmental factors of the lives that we cultivate that are still forming our aesthetic temperament, is how Oscar Wilde talks about our aesthetic sensibility. And you could hear that. What I heard John saying is, especially folks who are in creative callings, it's not just a matter of how you apprentice yourself to the specific craft of your artistic vocation. It's also a question of how you sort of curate the wallpaper of your everyday life, because that's also shaping your imaginative and creative capacity. So this distinction I'm making between, let's say, fine art, artifacts, and objects, and an aesthetic life, the aesthetic aspect of a life, is actually a distinction I learned from one of my teachers named Calvin Searveld, who I studied with in Toronto many, many years ago. And actually, it brought to mind a quote. And so, at the risk of the absent-minded professor trying to manage technology, I want to share my screen with you, I hope. And I want to pull up this quote. Can you all see that? Let's see. And how can I make this play? Here we go. On my messy, can you all see that? I hope somebody, yeah. And now I can't quite read the quote. I'm going to read it from the book. It's from a book called Rainbows for the Fallen World. Let me see if, because my photo images are blocking my access here for a second. Here's Searveld. He says, oh, friends, I'm sorry. See, this is why they should only give us chalk. That's about the extent of my capacity.
Jamie, would it be helpful if I read it?
Yeah, can you see it all? Why can't I see it all? Thank you.
Yes. So I'll read it. On my messy work desk, strewn with foreign language books, untold years of scribbled notes, folders, journals, correspondence, minutes, and manuscripts. Sometimes my wife puts a tiny green vase filled with sweet peas from the garden, my favorite flower. Their fragile, delicate, almost watercolored hues and tissues gentle the papers, busyness, and hard work with a restful, untoiling glory.
Thanks for saving me there, Jess. I love this picture. It's the sort of workaday environment, and there is this tiny vase of sweet peas from the garden. And I love how Searveld turns an adjective into a verb, and he says the very presence of these sweet peas gentles the environment, and it adds a sense of this untoiling glory. I was thinking of this because yesterday I walked downstairs and I glimpsed in our downstairs bathroom this little scene. Don't tell my wife Deanna I took a picture of the bathroom. I don't know how she would feel about this. But this is I walked past the open door of the bathroom downstairs by the kitchen, and I caught sight of this, and my heart just kind of leapt a couple times. And so I was reminded of that Searveld quote, and then I got thinking to myself, why does this delight me so? What is going on here? And so what am I experiencing when I experience this sort of wonderful, delightful surprise of this beautiful arrangement of flowers that my wife Deanna has cut from her own garden, placed in this gorgeous vase, and set them in this very pedestrian environment? Well, I think this is an example of what Searveld and I would talk about as a way of cultivating an aesthetic life in which this untoiling glory sort of suffuses and infuses everything and everywhere. And so I spent a few moments just kind of trying to think about, why is this so wonderful? Why do I love this so much? Why did it make my day? And I think there are a number of different characteristics, actually, of what's happening here, all of which are characteristics of an aesthetic life. The one is, and by the way, I don't think of all of these in the moment of experiencing the delight of it, but if I sort of pause, if I do something like what Marina was calling that sort of slow looking and start asking myself the question of what I'm experiencing as I delight in this, it seems to me I'm experiencing someone's intentionality, right? These aren't just flowers growing in the garden, which also, by the way, are wonderful and show a kind of care and curation. But here now, these are the flowers that have been selected, arranged. There is a kind of curation that has happened here. And I guarantee you that there were places where some stocks were put and Deanna said, no, that's not right, that doesn't work, and she pulled it out and put something else there, and then something was missing and she went and grabbed something else from the garden and said that added something. There is a kind of care that is exhibited here, and part of what's going on, I would say, is my imagination, dare I say, as Oscar Wilde does, my soul is resonating with actually something that the human has contributed to creating this experience. So there's intentionality, there's curation, there's care. In the aesthetic of it, there is a kind of proportionality, a harmony, different kinds of contrast. So it has, as Marina said, it has some of the characteristics of what we look for in a work of art. And then there's just the sheer delight and pleasure of what I'm going to call playfulness. In fact, Seerveld says this is actually what really defines the aesthetic aspect, the aesthetic moment of life, is what he calls play or allusivity. This obliqueness, this kind of the way in which things work and mean without just being linear and direct and pedestrian, but there is a sort of slant, as Dickinson put it. There is a play of light. There is an indirectness of how I am experiencing something here, and that's what the imagination is processing. There is play, there is whimsy, and then I think what I settled on as part of what really makes me love this is, I'm going to call it gratuity. Gratuity. It doesn't have to be. There's no reason for it. It's not necessary. It's not efficient. It's not instrumental. It's not accomplishing anything other than being there to delight everyone who stops to wash their hands. And that gratuity of the beautiful, that gratuity of the aesthetic, I think, is part of the countercultural aspect of cultivating an aesthetic life and an aesthetic home and an aesthetic household, because we are refusing the sort of flattened efficiencies and calculated rationalities of our commodified world. And we are just saying, this is just because the rose blooms without why. And I think that gratuity is its own echo and analog of grace. That this is a preamble of a way of opening and making me available and responsive to a mercy, a gifting, a grace that comes also without why, without reason, without justification, without defense. It is just sheer gift that comes from a God whose love and care and attention and beauty is given to me, not because I deserve it, but only because of God's own overflowing character. And to sort of build our lives in ways such that we make our household spaces, our homes, our apartments, our dorm rooms, places that reflect this kind of attention, intention, care, curation. Let's not underestimate how much that can be a kind of witness, a preparing of the way, an ambassadorship for the kind of God we know, who is goodness, truth, and beauty. I'll stop there. And if I can stop sharing, sorry, everybody. Let's see. There we go.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to ask all of you to come back on the screen. Thank you so much. I have so many thoughts. And I should note, I meant to note this at the beginning, that part of the inspiration for this panel was actually a piece that Jamie wrote for Image a few years back called "The Art We Live With," based on that line from Oscar Wilde. So I wanted to make sure I noted that. So this time we'll sort of spend a little time here kind of in conversation together. And as I said, we'll then open up for questions, and we already have several really lovely questions down in that Q&A box. But the first question I guess I wanted to throw out to all of you, and I think all of you have touched on this a bit, and then particularly in James's remarks just now, but I'm wondering, so obviously I'm sure, so all of you kind of work at least in some way in the arts, as I do myself. But I'm wondering how we might sort of speak to people, whether they're here right now, maybe drawn to this topic, or other people in our own lives who have this sense that art, whether we mean high art or this distinction of the aesthetic kind of qualities of life, that's just not for them, right? So like sort of seeing that. So I think I'm wondering what you have, any thoughts you might have to that question, and sort of this idea of like, on one level, they might already be engaging in it and they don't really realize it. But on the flip side, sort of seeing like, well, there may be something worth here in sort of opening myself up to this kind of training of my senses of the eye. So I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that, what you might say to someone that maybe says, I don't know. John.
Just to dive in real quick here, one of the bits from the essay that Jamie wrote about the art we live with, near the beginning, he talks about walking into well-designed monumental buildings, galleries, libraries, and the sort of instinctive, even if you're not really an arts person, you're going to start appreciate that. And I think that can be a level of entry in some way to some people where they don't normally think of art being something in their everyday life. But when you take them to a place like that, they go, oh, I see it. I see it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's something in museums and with museum education that we confront a lot. People saying, oh, I don't know how to look at this. I'm not interested in this. I'm not smart enough for this. And I would say a lot of people are trained to think that art is one thing. Like you go to a museum and maybe the wall panel telling you how to look at it is just very like, it's straight out of an art history book, very technical. You're told to be quiet, behave in a certain way. So of course you're going to think that's not for you if that's not what you're interested in. And some people that's what they want. But for other people, that's not the approach that's interesting or applicable. And there's a lot of energy right now in museums trying to invite different voices to expand what is art. Because you think of the collections in many Western museums, it's by a certain type of artist, and other arts are, it's more artisan. Or domestic, like quilting, for example. That's not high art. So there's a big change happening even in the question of what is art, what's worthy of being collected, studied. It's a big question. And if you feel like art isn't for you, there might be a very good reason you feel that. And, that's not a problem. And, but you don't have to stay there. There are other ways to engage with the arts, either appreciating them or creating them, that are equally capital A art as well.
Well, I'd like to answer that question by pointing out what Marina said earlier about just noticing how you feel. And sometimes we walk into a space that's chaotic or messy or ugly. I was trying to think of another word, and we feel that way while we're in the space. And there's when there's attention paid to it, we feel calm, we feel valued and cared for. When we're in that space. And it's same for public spaces. I know there's been some restaurants also that I'm like, the food's good here, but I don't really want to hang out, or I don't know, there was a school recently that I walked to and there was just stuff piled all over on the walls. And I said, this is kind of hard to learn in when it's so chaotic. So I think it is for everyone. We just don't think about it in that way. So I think Marina's point of just kind of noticing how you feel in certain spaces can answer that question for you.
Yeah, I think it's it really depends on what you think a human being is. Depends on your view of human personhood, and I think the imagination is a core aspect of being human. It's not, so in that sense, art and the aesthetic is not just for artsy people. It's for humans. And I would say if we aren't more intentional about cultivating, I forget how John put it, something like cultivating your taste or cultivating, feed your sensibility. Well, you're just seeding the shaping and forming of that to ugliness, to all the kind of flattened realities that we find around us. And so you're still living an aesthetic life. It's just an impoverished one, a terribly impoverished one. And I think that's stunting an aspect of your humanity. I mean, I guess I would also, and I think this is what we've all been talking about, we're pointing out that, there is something in the human that responds to design. For example, like I was thinking, when I pick up my Chemex in the morning, this is very hipster nonsense, but when I pick up my Chemex in the morning, it is a fantastic artifact that has both this beautiful ergonomic truth about it, and it also, that combination of wood and glass and leather is just like it's sort of tapping a bit visceral and I think almost sort of primal, and my soul is kind of responding to that, I think, even if I'm never thinking about it. So it's exactly why I think we have to become more intentional and cultivate awareness, because we don't realize how we're being shaped.
Yeah, I think.
Can I just,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Marina.
Oh, I was going to add to that too, that I think that's really important. And I don't think it has to be I'm just coming from an experience of pandemic parenting a toddler. Life feels there are very thin margins. And I just moved to a new house in that time too. And I kind of felt this, if my house is ugly, I'm doomed, but I have zero margins to do anything. And so I think design too, it can be when you have the space and the time to do something really beautiful and explore that's wonderful. And when you don't have that space or time or resources, it can be small. Like my husband put up the packing paper that our son had drawn crayons of. There's nothing I'm going to share publicly because it's not, but it brings me joy. It's this color and it didn't take any effort. It just taped on the wall. So I think it doesn't have to be another thing to add to our list. If it gives us pleasure and gives us life, yes. And if we don't have any margin to do it, there's still ways to get fulfilled in that way. It doesn't have to be a task.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think in some ways, right, all of you are speaking to the sense of sometimes it's an experience that sort of opens us up to this sort of need that we have as humans, but we often, I think, just in terms of in society, we just forget things are so fast. We need all these, we need to get things done. This talk that I sort of referenced in my opening remarks from Ilsa Crawford, she gave all these examples from the soup kitchen to an airport, to a hotel, right? And some of them were, had huge budgets and some had small budgets. And even at the end, there was someone who sort of still was pushing back saying but in these soup kitchens, don't we just need to feed more people? Don't we just need to do that? And her sort of call was that, yes, but also this, right? She found that people wanted to stay, that relationships formed. And there was this sort of, this need that these men and women had that they didn't even realize they were needing in their life. And I think that's something that's important just to keep in mind, because I think we often think we just don't have time for it, or it's sort of, because it's a gratuity, it's not an important one, but it is, it's right. It's feeding us as humans.
Just really quickly, my experience as a kid growing up in a family that was somewhat impoverished, but my mom loved art, but she was not. I would not, say she had a really sophisticated taste. But one of the things that she used to do is she would get things like colored duct tape and say, "Well, this is going to add some nice color to this area," and she'd put colored duct tape around a mirror, or she would do things like get a Sharpie and draw happy faces on the cushions that were going on the couch. And these are things that were pleasing to her, and it to us as kids also made the felt space feel sort of welcoming. No person who is an artistic high level person would walk into that space and say, "Well, that's beautiful." But on another level, for us as her kids, is an expression of our mother's love for us, as well as like, "Oh, that feels nice to look at that."
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me a lot of someone actually in the questions mentions Willa Cather, but she has several scenes. There's one in particular in Shadows on the Rock where they're stuck for winter. Actually, no, My Antonia, my bad. Where they can't get out because they're snowed in, and so they have to like completely reorient how they think about how they're going to give gifts, how they're going to kind of make their space in their home. It's such a beautiful scene that reminds me of that a little bit. Yeah, so I think I'm actually there's a lot of questions here. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A. But as I mentioned to all of you, if you have any questions that you also want to sort of explore, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to start here. There is from Mark. So he says, with reference to Jamie's description of his chemics, which I assume he uses at the same time every day, can you all speak to the quality of rhythm, or dare I say liturgy, that is featured in aesthetic objects and spaces we experience repeatedly?
I mean, I could take a first shot.
Sure.
It does strike me that precisely because we have rhythms of repetition, both sort of daily and then seasonally, that it's another reason why we want to curate spaces and artifacts that can bear the weight of that repetition. Do you know what I mean? That will continue to sort of absorb us and fascinate us and serve us in a way. Although this is probably not what the questioner is asking about, but it also made me think about, you would not judge it from looking at me, but I actually have a great appreciation for fashion as one of these modes of aesthetic life and the kind of style that people can cultivate. And I think it's one of the great gifts of we finally reached sweater weather, and so there's something about getting to inhabit a different aesthetic season fashion wise that I think is part of the great joys and adds the variety to that.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that, like, repetition wise, we were earlier talking a little bit about beauty of nature and looking at it more carefully. Marina was talking about that, but my house now, it borders on a nature area here in Cincinnati, and if you walk through it a couple times a week, you are constantly seeing change. And to me, my family, well, especially my family, they are all kids, and my wife all grew up in California, and that landscape changes almost nothing over the course of the year. You have a brief time where it's green in the spring, and then after that, it's gone. And so to them, it's been sort of mind-blowing. You walk through the same space that you were in a couple of days ago, and now there are these entirely new flowers, these entirely new things. And it also, the experience of that, plus the experience of gardening, to go back to liturgy, gave me a much greater appreciation of liturgy. The way that liturgical things change throughout the year. If you have experience with gardening or observing nature, it really brings a lot of that more to life for you, because you're like, oh yeah, I relate to this and that. In Spirit of Liturgy by Ratzinger, he talks a lot about how a lot of our perceptions of liturgical time are actually shaped by Northern Hemisphere Europe, and that we should try to find ways of looking at it where we start to understand the perspective of the global church. This is kind of going in an entirely different tangent, so I'll stop talking. But it's an interesting perspective to try to figure out, liturgically, like the Christmas season and stuff like that. What does it mean to somebody whose seasons are flowing in what we would consider an opposite direction up north?
Yeah, that's actually maybe a good segue. I'm sort of trying to merge two questions. And Shemaiah and Marina, if you have more thoughts on that question about rhythm, please feel free to interrupt me. But Emily asks that she says she loves this point about playfulness as being a kind of aspect of this aesthetic kind of practice. And she says, it seems like it's a return to childlikeness. How have you practically cultivated playfulness in your home? I think I'll just leave, I'm not going to, there's another great question kind of jumping off of what John was just saying about decorating for holidays. So we can maybe circle back to that possibly, but I wanted to maybe talk about this like childlikeness and playfulness, which you definitely see in the Larsons for sure, but yeah.
Well, I just as this is not a decor thing at all, but back when I was still in California and working daily at the offices of Ignatius Press, I would just bring back reams and reams of scratch paper that were rejected manuscripts or manuscript print-offs. And my kids would draw on those all the time. There's paper everywhere, all over the house. And constructing things out of the paper, drawing things on the paper. And it's something that I think has fed them artistically, even if it is pretty messy and it's hard to put up with sometimes. But it is one of I think the key elements of playfulness around our house is just the sheer amount of paper that goes all over the place.
I think having children gave me permission to revisit that sort of gaze that I didn't really have as a child. And not that you have to be a parent to do that, but you do need to give yourself permission. There's something about that. Like, it's okay to be silly or to take some time to look at things. I remember, this is silly, but we take a lot of walks just in our urban neighborhood. And I remember maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, it occurred to me that there's different textures that I always want to touch when I'm walking, but I never gave myself permission to do that. But then once I had children, I said, well, okay, let's all touch this, whether it was like those lamb ears, leaves, or, something pokey, and there's something about giving yourself permission to do that, like Marina said, that does something to your soul, to be able to just stop and seriously pet a tree because it looks really cool. And I think that just being able to do that with my children helped myself. And I came across that Ted Kooser poem recently about, he writes about his mother, and he's grieving the loss of his mother. And there's a line at the end that says, if something like, if you had never shown me how to look at the world, I would have been forever lonely. And I read that poem to the boys, my sons, and without a preface. And they said, oh, Mom, that's you. You've taught us how to see things. And inside, I'm thinking, on the contrary, you've taught me how to see things. So I guess to answer that question is to just give yourself permission,
And I think play is like at the heart of all of this, because play can be fun and silly, but it doesn't have to be. There are games, their heart are experimenting with different worlds. And by entering play, especially as a child, we're experimenting with different ways of being in the world. So there's this artist named Nina Cachadorian, she does this series that she took on a long haul airplane flight, 14 hours, I think, where she went to the bathroom well, she did a whole bunch of things, but one part of it was going to the bathroom when no one else was there and taking self-portraits in the Flemish style using like toilet seat covers. And these portraits, she looks like a Flemish portrait, but she was playing and she was experimenting with, are there ways to engage with this experience that's notoriously boring, a long haul flight, and make it alive? So yes, part of it was silly, but part of it is kind of serious. Or, you know, how do I want to, what's calling me to engage with experience? What's a new way to look here? And so I think as we're going through our lives, to have that curiosity and openness, like, what do I want to make here? What can I, James has talked a lot about imagination. What do I imagine that the way that the world could be right now? And I think that's something that needs to be, since I've kind of been thinking about that, I find it everywhere. And someone asked a question about how to bring their full self to the museum, not just show up how you're supposed to, but to really bring your whole being. Play. What do you think? What do you think would be interesting right now? What if maybe don't look at the paintings, maybe look at the light fixtures. You know, there's so many different ways to enter into experience, but when you're playing, you feel entitled. You feel like you have permission to show up in new ways. And so I think play is such a good, that someone pointed that out and that we've been talking about today. That's the heart. That's so important for exploring this.
Yeah, and I think play and story are so intertwined that what you just said, Marina, also made me think of, I had one art history professor in college who took us to the museum and really sort of, I think, in some ways like rocked people's worlds, because she told us, like, don't worry about everything we've necessarily been talking about in class or what these plaques say, but like, what's the story in this piece? Like, talk to me, tell me the story that's here. And that really changed, was like very formative for me in thinking about art itself, but also just thinking about the stories behind things. Shemaiah spoke to this as well, the stories that objects they hold, both because they might already have these stories just by their, you know, how they look or what they are, but also by the memories that they hold for us specifically. Yeah.
There was that one question about that you brought up briefly about decorating for the holidays, which I think it's, you know, things can be ephemeral that you're decorating with, especially if you're with children. Children love decorating for the holidays. It's the thing that makes it come alive to them. Holidays that involve, you know, not just Christmas, but other holidays of the year. For example, my oldest child was born on Halloween. And I know that Halloween has gotten an outsized influence on culture right now, but for our family, it's turned into this month-long celebration of making our own costumes and coming up. And it's always, kids always come up with something offbeat. And but then the other, you know, seasons of the year, making sure that you have that seasonal rhythm in your life, whether it's, you know, bringing out certain objects at certain times of the year, or decorating with different colors at different times of the year, different foods at different times of the year. I think that's really important to not just to individual life, but, you know, family life. And when kids grow up around that, it really makes that cycle of holidays and rhythm of life come alive to them in a way that I think wouldn't happen if you just kind of did the bare minimum.
I think in relation to that too, I wonder if this is the one space where we can give ourselves permission. I love this whole idea of giving ourselves permission to try things, to play, to fail. I do wonder too if this is probably one of the spaces where I feel like we give ourselves permission to be kitschy, but only because the kitschy artifacts that we might decorate our home with are actually enchanted with a history, with a shared meaning in our family. And so we, you know, these are not the most beautiful artifacts. These aren't the most beautiful form of the Magi, for example, or so, but they are the ones that we inherited, and they are the ones that we have shared, you know, epiphany worship around. And so they kind of come with a meaning in their form that maybe we're appropriating them in ways that are slightly camp, but they are meaningful, and it's still an aesthetic moment of what we're doing.
Definitely. This isn't exactly like a direct correlation from there, but someone, I just saw a question asking, this is from Abigail. She said, I love the Larsons and their book, but do you have any advice for a couple with very different aesthetics / taste, especially in, I imagine this is their case. One is an artist, the other is more focused on efficiency. So if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Well, my wife does not really decorate our house. I'll tell you that. she's fairly uninterested. But she's very, very good with all of the practical elements of running a household. And she does not object to me being kind of the household curator. The thing that she does do is she will put a break on things that are actually impractical for a family to have in the home. Wait a minute, where are you going to put that? She's one of the sort of traps that we've had out here for me is that there's a local estate auction website that has a warehouse just a few miles away from my house, and I will look there and I'll end up putting a bid on something, not expecting to win it, and then suddenly we have this new piece of art, and we've got to figure out a place in the house to put it. And so I think it actually can be very complimentary to have somebody in the household who's more artistically inclined and somebody who's willing to step up and say, no, this has to function as a house for humans as well. So I don't see it necessarily being a bad thing.
So one question here is from, let's see, Dennis. He sort of is seeing that many of the panelists, where did that question go? There we go. Many of the panelists are arguing for the aesthetic dimension of life and how it awaits our discovery if our gaze is properly attuned. And so he's wondering if the panelists can speak to what extent this attunement is dependent upon a kind of theological commitment of the observer, because he says there's a lot of theological language being used. So I thought that was a kind of interesting perspective maybe to bring into the conversation. Oh, Jamie, there you go.
Sorry, I think certain theological frameworks and paradigms can undergird this sensibility, but I don't think either knowing them, understanding them, or being able to articulate them is a condition of cultivating this mode of life. Do you know what I mean? I think we we always understand more than we know. I think we all have a kind of know-how that outstrips our knowing what. And I think this is actually a great, I think what's more important is probably being embedded in communities of friendship and exchange where I am being apprenticed and sort of acquiring things that I don't even realize. Do you know what I mean? Like we're cultivating a sensibility, and by making myself available to certain communities, I am always learning more than I realize. And so I think there's a kind of training and priming for living into this that will always outstrip my ability to sort of intellectually formulate it. But then I do think it's worth some of us going through the exercise to say why this is, I think, the working out of an incarnational sensibility about the world, or a sacramental sensibility about the world. And then that can maybe prime and prompt others to dive into it in a new way.
One thing that this is something that I really love about the new town that I've moved to, Cincinnati, is the downtown area, which is known as Over the Rhine, is completely populated with these beautiful murals. One of the most striking of which is a giant depiction of the Annunciation, and it's a non-standard one. The Holy Spirit is represented as a bluebird, I believe, and Mary is black, and the angel doing the Annunciation appears to be Latino. And people who are just walking through there, my kids, other people, they see this, and it does start to, get some gears shifting. But the theological aspect of a piece of art like that, what's interesting to me, having been in artistic circles for a while, is that seems to linger on in people who've moved into what they would consider as a non-Christian or beyond Christianity or post-Christian world. One of the painters I took lessons from for a while back, he had this very striking painting that he had just finished, and I was looking at it and I said, "Oh, this is a depiction of the fall?" Because it was a nude man and woman that were exchanging some kind of fruit. But they were also standing knee deep in water. And he said, no, this is just it seemed interesting to me, this composition. It's sort of influenced by some things I saw in the museum, but it's not supposed to be any one thing. And I've since noticed that with a lot of other artists, they will unconsciously mimic depictions of the Virgin Mary, depictions of the Passion and stuff like that. And sometimes it's explicit that they're taking this in and trying to recontextualize it in another way. But oftentimes I think it's out there. If you're somebody who's a visual person, it's going to come into you. So if you expose yourself, your family, your children to images, I think the theological element, it gets carried through in art in a way where you're not even conscious that it's flowing into you.
I think for me, I don't need to use any big theological words or concepts. I believe that God is present all around us. And so I'm always looking for where I can find him. And usually that's where something beautiful or something good has happened. Talking with people who are like-minded, I feel God's presence here now. When I pet that tree, the redwood that I love on the walk to school, that's God's presence. And so I think, like I said in my reflection, just any moment where you feel God's glory shining through and something's better than it should be, and you feel like you just want to capture those moments as often as you can throughout the day in the ordinary. I only go to Mass on Sunday and that's beautiful, but I want those moments throughout my week to hold on to.
I love how the question asker talked about language and like the types of language we're using. Because, I spent a lot of my time reading museum language, but also I've started reading about contemplation more. And a lot of the language feels almost like it could be for either like slow looking or contemplation, like a long loving gaze at the real, or not subject object dialogue, but subject to subject gazing. And so I think that's very interesting that different spheres are finding words to describe that moment of feeling there's aliveness around you that you can tap into. And I think that's very interesting that that person talked about language, about how there are words and then there's that experience that we can feel, and what framework, what lens do we want to use to talk about that and explore that.
Jess, can I just add? I really feel like the most sort of theological infusion in this sort of conversation is to be humanists. In other, if I think the question is what can sustain an understanding of human beings such that we realize that we need this, that we want it, that we long for it. Henri de Lubac used to talk about a natural desire for the supernatural, right? You have this sort of this material desire for something more. And I think just human response to beauty, imagination, and the aesthetic is a sign and a signal that we are made for something more than a commodified, flattened, instrumentalized world that we live in. And in a sense, it's what intellectual resources do you have to appreciate the depth and profundity and richness of being a human being? I sometimes tell my students, imagine human beings are like, every human being is a 12-stringed guitar. And so much of society just plays 6 of those strings. And then all of a sudden something plucks, 4 more of those strings, and a piece of us comes alive that we didn't realize before. I think that's it. The theological point actually comes out in the profundity and depth of how we think about the human.
Yeah, and I think also we've spoken a lot to the way that an actual experience of beauty or seeing in this way can sort of spark this openness. But I think also sometimes, not always, on the flip side, an experience of the opposite can also kind of jar us to realize like maybe I do need something more than this. And I'm thinking here of 2 things specifically. So an experience I had in a train station in New York, and just sort of, it felt so inhuman. I was pregnant at the time. There was nowhere to sit. I couldn't find a place to sit. It was all gray. And I remember thinking, why? Like, was this designed for humans? And then sort of likewise, I remember reading a bit about William Morris and the sort of arts and crafts movement. And I hadn't realized that part of that was sparked by the experience of industrialization and seeing the sort of the kind of environment that we were placing humans in, and sort of this desire to offer something different and to sort of offer something of beauty, not just for the rich, but for everyone. And so I wanted to sort of point to those 2 examples, just because I think sometimes it's actually that clash that can actually jar us into realizing that we need something more, and a sort of reminder of our humanness.
Absolutely. Well said.
So I think we have time for one more question. And I don't know if there's any that you also have seen so far that specifically you wanted to address, but I can also kind of pick the final one here.
I just want to make a vote for our next discussion, something that Marina just mentioned, which was art and contemplation. I'm working on exactly that same intersection right now. And it's fascinating to me, Marina, there's something percolating where people are seeing this resonance between the 2. And I think we might both agree that maybe actually contemporary art is perhaps most primed to draw out that kind of contemplation. But so let's do this again in 6 months.
That sounds great. I'm definitely up for that. Yeah, well, maybe one place to end, and maybe just as like final thoughts for you all, is someone mentioned towards the end here, Meredith, sort of wondering if we can speak further. I think we've been doing this a bit already, but speaking further to the lovely in the mundane as well. So she thought of this when she heard Marina and Shemaiah, particularly Marina mentioning like taking the diapers out. And so wondering, she references Brother Lawrence, but this sense of learning to see the beauty in the mundane as well.
I loved that question. This commenter talked about how in that story with the sunset and the diapers, she was saying, my attention went to the diaper bag, or like that garbage bag full of stinky diapers. Is that worthy of attention too? And I love that question. And I think that's the challenge, to give that same careful attention to things that maybe we're told or we don't consider are worth our attention, and what happens there when we really dive in. So I loved that comment. I thought that was a beautiful reframing. And yes, I think everything is rife with aliveness and life, and the stories that we can attach to it to help us see what's really going on there.
Yeah, for me, one of the best examples of this is when we moved into our home here in Cincinnati. The front is covered with local stone on the lower level, and it was shortly after we moved in that I was standing outside trying to figure out, well, what can we do with the front yard is just so boring looking and blah, and what can we do with it? And I started to look a little closer at the stone, and then I realized it was completely full of small fossils. all of these small fossils, and I started to try to take some pictures of them, but the impact, you couldn't quite get it unless you're standing there with it a few inches from your face looking at it. And I guess it's a feature of the Ohio River Valley here that most of the stones that have been pulled out of the river area, the limestone, which is used for just landscaping, they're all full of these little fossils, shells mostly from back when this was a sea. But it just reminded me, like, stopping and taking a closer look at something, it often just reveals these things to you that you, from standing far away, it totally gets glossed over. As somebody who's very nearsighted, this is something that happens fairly often when I'm not wearing my glasses. I'll pick up something like this mug that I've got, and suddenly I'll start to notice the detail of the glazing, and in a way that I didn't notice before, because I'm suddenly pulling it into focus beyond my lenses. And so, taking a moment to take a closer look at something that you have just gotten used to walking past, that can often serve as an inspiration as well as just a greater appreciation of your surroundings.
I want to piggyback on something Marina suggested, which is like, oh, how could the kind of looking I do in a museum prime me to look at my everyday life in a new way? And the guy at Calvin University just has to make a small plug for the Dutch Protestant painting tradition here, which is the great gift of the Dutch and Flemish heritage was precisely all of a sudden the painter's eye and attention and care turns to those kitchen spaces that never ever warranted such attention before. And I do think there's a sanctification of ordinary life that is getting worked out there aesthetically, which then can prime us to bring it back to our ordinary life again. So the art object sort of intensifies that attention, and then we can learn from that, be shaped by it, and bring it back to our everyday life. And there's a very distinctly religious heritage to that practice.
Well, thank you so much to all of you, in particular to all of our panelists, Marina, John, Shemaiah, and Jamie. It's just been so lovely to get to talk with all of you and explore these questions and these thoughts. And I want to thank all of our attendees who joined us today live. And I also, again, want to say thank you to all of our co-sponsors. So obviously Collegium Institute is running this, but we would not be able to have done this without Prux, Dappled Things, Image Journal, Lumen Christi Institute, Nova Forum, the Catholic Studies program at the University of St. Thomas, and Wellspring, a Mother Artist project. So thank you again. I hope that you guys will all join us for a future Collegium event. We intend to continue doing a few online events a year now that things have returned to campus for us at Penn. And so we look forward to more Ars Vivendi events and other online events. So thank you to all of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.